The first speaker in today's first technical session is Dr. Ashish Lele. I invite you, sir, to dais. Dr. Lele hails from Karnataka. He had his education in engineering from the Department of Chemical Technology in Bombay, and PhD he did in Delaware, America. Now he is currently the director of CSIR National Laboratory in Pune. His research interests are in the field of alternative energy systems with particular focus on hydrogen ecosystem, advanced materials for new manufacturing paradigm, sustainability, and circular economy. Now, he was in 2010-17 scientist CSIR-NCL that efforts developing PEM fuel cell technology in a consortium of the 3 CSIR laboratories and 3 Indian industries. He was a research associate at the Department of Chemical Engineering, University of Cambridge. He got the Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Award in Engineering Sciences in 2006, ICT Distinguished Alumnus Award in 2013, CSIR Young Scientist Award in 1994, INSA Young Scientist Award in 1996, startup companies he had 2, patents 6, publications 75 papers, and 17 students he guided to PhD degrees.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to come here and present some of my work before you. It's a real honor, real privilege to be here. Thank you, Pradeep, for inviting me. I'm sorry I couldn't come yesterday, but I'm absolutely glad that I could still make it for today's session. So without further, and thank you, sir, for the very kind introduction. Let us get started. This is a little old piece of work, but I thought I'm not a chemist by training. I'm a chemical engineer by training. But because this is the Frontiers in Chemical Sciences conference, I thought I will take the risk of presenting a little old work to you, because this is very closely related to as much chemistry as I can do. So this is about a class of materials called hydrogels. I'll tell you a little bit about it. And what I'm going to talk about is that there are 2 kinds of interactions, molecular interactions, which are very critical to some of the most interesting properties of polymeric hydrogels. And these are interactions which we call hydrophilic interactions, where the polymer loves water, and hydrophobic interactions where the polymer hates water. And I think the only message that I want to give in this talk is that if you manage somehow to have a very unique critical balance between these 2 molecular interactions, synthetic polymer gels can start mimicking biomaterials, right? Nature is abound with maintaining a really unique, really wonderful balance between these 2 molecular interactions, hydrophilic and hydrophobic. And it is fundamentally one of the reasons why materials in nature can do very, very interesting things. You know, they're designed to do many interesting things. And so the idea is, can you mimic nature to some extent? And if you want to do that, you have to try and get these 2 interactions to reach some kind of very unique balance. So that's really the message that I wanted to give in this talk. The rest is about details that I will show you what we have tried to do over the past 15 years or so. This is my wonderful laboratory. This is National Chemical Laboratory, situated in the city of Pune, a lovely city up in the hills from Mumbai, about 120 kilometers from Mumbai. And this lab was set up, it's little younger to your lab. The lab was opened in 1950. You opened in 1948, we opened in 1950. So we'll be celebrating our 75 years in another 2 years. When the lab opened, the motto of the laboratory is given in this sentence here. And for the last 73 years of our existence, all of us who have been very emotionally attached to the laboratory, take this motto very, very seriously. It talks about three things. It says this purpose of this laboratory is to advance knowledge, right? And so one of the things that we are very keen to do always is to do really good quality science, high class science, and that's advancing the frontiers of scientific knowledge. But we don't stop there. The motto enshrines application of that knowledge. So application of chemical sciences. So we are a chemical laboratory, focus is on chemical sciences, and so it's all about application of that science. That means we do a lot of focus on translating the science that we do, and in the engineering parlance, we call it the technology readiness level, the TRL. So we start from lab scale discoveries, take it onwards to inventions, innovations, and then further to commercialization. So that's the application of knowledge. And the whole purpose of doing all of this is for the good of the people. In a very generic sense, good of the people, but that means creating wealth for the country, making sure you develop technologies which are indigenous technologies, and so on and so forth. Focus is on Indian chemical industry, right? So that's the purpose of this laboratory, to advance knowledge, to apply the knowledge mainly for the Indian chemical industry, through which the wealth gets translated. So the topic of today's talk is about this class of materials called hydrogels. So these are, this is a small powder that I'm showing you. You put water in it, and what it does is it absorbs a huge amount of water, copious quantities of water. It can go to 10 times its own weight. It can really take hundreds of grams of water per gram of solid. And so, what was a liquid initially turned out to be a gel which can sustain its own weight, right? So this becomes a very thick sort of solid. And this is a class of material that we are all used to. All the baby diapers, the sanitary napkins, they all contain these kinds of superabsorbing polymers. We call them SAP. Now, NCL was investigating and developing the technology to make superabsorbing polymers in the 1960s, right? So this is really an old stuff that I'm showing you. And this polymer, even at that time, today we call it sustainable and we make a big fuss out of it. In those days, it was sort of matter of fact to do these things. So this is actually a starch-based polymer, right? The main backbone of this polymer is starch. Starch derived from all kinds of things. And it is grafted with some other polymers which cross-link these starch molecules, right, to form these three-dimensional network of polymers. And that three-dimensional network absorbs huge amounts of water. So that's this polymer. And we had trade named it Jala Shakti, the strength to absorb water. This polymer was commercialized, this technology was commercialized. So this is an example of how we look at deep science and then commercialize it. And the trade name of this material was Jal Shakti, and it was manufactured by a company just close, it was between Mumbai and Pune. It's called Indian Organic Chemicals Limited. The company doesn't exist right now. It's been taken over by other companies. And unfortunately, this product does not exist in the market anymore, okay? Because the company couldn't market it. You have to be at the right time at the right place, and Jal Shakti was too early for India to get used to. So the company was not able to promote this product, market this product well. So today it actually doesn't exist. But interestingly, I have now 3 offers from companies who are all talking about sustainable polymeric hydrogels, sustainable superabsorbing polymers, and we are now in, again, once more licensing talks with 3 companies. So this is how, science, interesting things happen in science. But the reason we developed this polymer was to irrigate land, and the eastern part of Maharashtra, a place called Marathwada, is an arid region. It doesn't receive as much rainfall as the western part of Maharashtra receives. And so there is a need for putting these kinds of polymers in the soil, especially near the roots of the saplings as you plant them, so that they absorb a lot of water and then they keep slowly releasing the water to the roots so that you don't have to irrigate the land very often, right? So this was the primary purpose of developing this polymer. And so, as I said, the super absorbing polymers that we developed with the purpose of helping the farmers in these regions of arid climate, so that the agriculture there is helped. But at the same time, we were also looking at what else can we do with these polymers, right? And the question we were really enamored with was, can you put sort of life into the polymer? Not life as in life, but can you put aspects of life which mimic, life in general? For example, can you make these polymers respond to stimuli, which is something that life does? Can you make these polymers mobile on their own? Of course, in the presence of a stimuli. Can you make these polymers organize, self-organize? This is what life does. So many of these things that I've written here are in one way or another the aspect of life, right? And we're asking, can we now make these gels mimic some of these aspects of life? I'm not going to talk about all of them. I will only focus on the fundamentals of those two interactions, the hydrophilic and hydrophobic interactions. And if you balance them well, you can achieve some of these very interesting life mimicking behaviors. So that's all I'm going to talk about today. So I joined NCL in 1993. I was only 26 years old. And the moment I stepped in, the director of the lab at that point of time called me in his office and says, I have an interesting problem for you to look at. And this was a company based out of MIT in Boston. And they were trying to develop smart footwear for highly diabetic patients, okay? And why highly diabetic patients is there's something called a diabetes foot, for very diabetic patient. And if you take an IR image of the feet, you will see this map. And what it says is the regions which are red are higher temperatures and the regions which are green are low temperatures. And this is unusual in a highly diabetic patient. You get this very large temperature distribution on the foot. People like us, normal people, will not have this kind of very large temperature distribution. And this is to do with, diabetic condition where blood supply is non-uniform and many other biological things. But this is a problem for people with diabetic feet. And so what this company in MIT was trying to do was to have a polymeric sole to be placed inside the shoe, which can sense temperature and change shape to conform to the shape of the feet, right? And so the question given to me was, if you have these kinds of 5-6 degrees temperature variations, can you design a soft gel which will sense temperature and change shape, okay? So that was basically the problem given to us. And when I started looking at it more deeply, it had all to do with what is called volume phase transitions. And I'll tell you a little bit about what those volume phase transitions are. And my job, as given to me at that time, was understand fundamentally what causes the volume phase transition. So derive a molecular basis for these and see if there are interesting insights that I could give to chemists who can then tailor these interactions in the polymer gels and make them sense temperature and change the shape of the temperature. But as typically science happens, one thing leads to another, and lots of other interesting discoveries came out. And today when we look back and say, look at all that body of knowledge that we developed, it seemed to me that it was almost like a tightrope trapeze artistry. If you have these two interactions and achieve that balance, you can do very interesting things, just like a walker who tries to walk on a tight rope and has to have good balance between the two, between the left and the right. And if one of them exceeds the other, the rope artist can fall down, right? So it's this tightrope walk which is very important. Okay, so what is this volume phase transition? Okay, I'm going to talk about this phenomena based on this example of a polymer called polynipan, poly-N-isopropyl acrylamide. The structure is shown there. This is poly-N-isopropyl acrylamide. And I want to point out to these two functional groups. One is an amide group and one is an isopropyl group, as you can imagine. This group, of course, is very hydrophobic, right? It would hate water, but just adjacent to this is a group which would love water. And you can already see that there are places where water can form hydrogen bonds with this particular group. So this is an interesting molecule that has both these hydrophilicity and hydrophobicity. Now, if you take this polymer and you dissolve it in water, so it's a non-cross-linked polymer. Think of it as a dilute polymer solution, and this is a polymer which is fairly high molecular weight. It loves water, so it swells, with a lot of water around it, and that happens at lower temperatures. At lower temperatures, it loves water, and then as you start heating up the gel, so as you go up in this axis, it phase separates. So if I'm starting anywhere in this region, it is a single phase solution, and as I increase temperature, it goes in this boundary which is given by this curve here. This curve is called the binodal curve or the cloud point curve. So as I move up here, I enter into a two-phase region, and the polymer actually precipitates out. So this is an interesting polymer. Normally when you want to dissolve something, you heat up, right? You stir and then you heat up and things dissolve. This is opposite. It dissolves in water at low temperature, and as you start heating up, it actually phase separates out, it precipitates out. And at a molecular level, what happens is this polymer is swollen nicely at low temperature, and as you start increasing the temperature, it just expels all the water out and collapses, right? And that's the precipitation that happens. Now, if you take this polymer and you cross-link it, and by cross-linking, it means that you stitch polymer chains together, right, with small amounts of cross-links, then you get a gel. It doesn't dissolve, it just swells. So at low temperature, it would swell, and as you increase temperature, it collapses, right? And so this is how the gel would behave. And so this is what is called a swelling ratio of the gel. So very low swelling ratio at high temperatures, that means the gel collapses, throws water out, and as you start decreasing the temperature, the swelling ratio increases, so the gel swells, right? So this transition is called the volume phase transition, right? It's volume because it grows, it expands in volume and collapses in volume, and it's a thermodynamic change, and that's why it's called a phase transition, right? So that's the origin of volume phase transition. Now, I was trying to understand why does this happen, right? If you have a polymeric gel, then there are two forces at least that you must account for this gel. One is the fact that this polymer chains are still bound to each other because they are chemically cross-linked, right? So they just can't go away from each other. To some extent, they can swell, but they can't just go further away from it, right? So there is something that traps these molecules. There's a force that wants to bring this molecule back. So it's like a rubber band. If you stretch it and you leave it, it will come back, right? There's an elastic force in the rubber band. A very similar elastic force exists in these polymers because of the cross-links. So that's the elastic force. So one must account for these elastic forces. And the other is the specific interactions. And particularly since we are dealing with hydrophilic polymers, you can expect a lot of hydrogen bonding that happens between water and the polymer. So, if you're trying to understand what is the molecular basis of these volume phase transitions in these hydrophilic polymers, you must at least have a model or have a theory that accounts for both of these things, the elastic forces and the specific intermolecular interactions. Now, I don't know if there are people here who are trained in polymer science, but there is a very, very classical theory. There is a Nobel laureate, Paul Flory, who developed the theory of these kinds of networks. It's an old theory. and it talks about osmotic pressure, which is a difference in chemical potential inside the gel and outside, which is water. And it has all these things, and you don't have to worry about what this means. This term here is the first one, which is the elastic forces, and these terms here are the interactions between molecules. Okay. Now this theory actually does not account for these very specific interactions, neither the hydrophilic interactions like hydrogen bonding nor hydrophobic interactions. Okay. And so, when I looked at this and I said, well, these molecules, these polymer gels must behave, because it's a thermodynamic transition, they must have an osmotic pressure. And what will determine these osmotic pressures? So if you go back to Flory's theory, which is the classical theory, this theory is really not applicable for these kinds of polymers. So you needed a little more sophisticated theory to understand this, right? And it took me back to my PhD days. I was doing PhD at that time. I was working on an interesting problem of taking a polymer, which is a biodegradable polymer. Actually, even in those days, we're taking polylactic acid, polycaprolactone, these are all very biodegradable polymers. And I was trying to dissolve them in this molecule. Okay, it's a R22, it's actually a refrigerant. It has 2 fluorine and 1 hydrogen atom. And this hydrogen atom is interesting because it can hydrogen bond with the ester group on the polymer, right? And what I was trying to do is to take this, it's actually a gas at room temperature, but you can compress it. It has a certain critical point, critical temperature and a critical pressure. And you can take this gas and compress it, heat it up a little bit, and it goes into supercritical region, right? So you take this supercritical gas, and at that state, it still can hydrogen bond with these polymers. So polymers can actually dissolve in a gas, but at higher pressure and higher temperature. And I was taking this gaseous solution and spraying it through a nozzle, a very fine nozzle, about 25 micron, very tiny nozzle. And interesting things happen. So the polymer, this solution, which is actually a gas, expands at supersonic velocities. You can get Mach 2, Mach 3 supersonic velocities. And as the gas expands, its density suddenly decreases, and the polymer, which was soluble at high density, that is at high pressure, pops out, precipitates out at low pressure. And you can get exquisite morphology by doing things like this. You can get microfibers. Each of these fibers is less than a micron in diameter. You can get nanoparticles and lots of interesting stuff you can make from this process. So while I was looking at this, I was also interested in understanding why the polymer dissolves in a gas, right? This is unusual. So I actually built a high pressure bomb in which I would charge the polymer and the gas and pressurize it and then depressurize it and measure through this quartz window. I could measure the transmittance of the solution. And if it is dissolved, it's highly transparent. If it precipitates, it becomes turbid, and I could watch it with a video camera from this glass window. So I was trying to measure experimentally what is called a cloud point curve from transparent solution to a cloudy solution. That's called a cloud point curve. So this is the kind of data I was generating as a function of pressure and temperature. There are these lines which differentiate between dissolved state and precipitated state. And I was also interested in understanding why this happens. So what is the theory that would capture these kinds of effects? And I was looking actually at a theory that was first published in 1976. And it's a theory that says that if you have a solute that has an acceptor molecule, an acceptor of hydrogen bonds, and a solvent that has a donor of hydrogen bonds, you can form this hydrogen bond. And there's something called the law of mass action that tells you how many hydrogen bonds are formed if you know the energy of interaction between the donor and acceptor. And if using these kinds of theories, you can actually expand the Flory-Huggins model and incorporate a term that accounts for hydrogen bonding, very specific hydrogen bonding between donor-acceptor groups, and a term that talks about other than hydrogen bonding interactions, dispersion interactions, which in a way talk about the hydrophobic interactions. So here is now a model that has the ability to capture both these interactions, the hydrogen bonding interactions and the hydrophobic interactions. And we need to add, of course, the elastic force terms to it. And if you do that, you can actually take this theory and see if it is applicable for the kind of hydrophilic, hydrophobic polymers that I was interested in at NCL. So I developed these models in my PhD days, and I said, wow, I can use exactly these models even at NCL, but for a completely different problem. So we started looking at this model, and so here is, after a lot of work, and skipping all of that work, this is the comparison between experimental data, which is the swelling of the polymer gel as a function of temperature. And you can see that the polymer is nicely swollen at low temperature, and then it suddenly collapses at high temperatures, right? So this is the volume phase transition, and the theory does a very good job of fitting the experimental data quite well. So now we said, okay, now I understand the molecular basis for this volume phase transition, and what else can the theory tell me? And so the first thing that the theory tells me is, if I look at the hydrogen bonds, then as the temperature increases, I can see that the interpolymer hydrogen bonds, that is the bonds between the polymer chains, actually grow, right? And this is why the polymer actually collapses. And at the same time, the hydrogen bonds between the polymer and the water starts to decrease. So the polymer hates water. As you increase temperature, it throws away all the hydrogen bonds and brings all the polymer hydrogen bonds itself. So the polymer collapses, throws all the water out. So that's the first thing that the theory told us. The second interesting thing that the theory told us is that this parameter that captures the hydrophobic interactions, right, has to have a temperature dependence, a very minute temperature dependence. If you look at the y-axis, there's hardly it's a very small difference. So this is how subtle it is. The hydrophobicity has to have a temperature dependence, but extremely subtle. It's not a very large change in the hydrophobic parameter. And so for quite some time, when we were publishing these papers, the main question that all the reviewers were asking is this true? You're claiming that these hydrophobic interactions should have a subtle temperature dependence, but does that actually happen? And interestingly, there are now these papers which have come out more recently, still about 10 years ago, that actually have done these measurements. And so here is an atomic force microscope where you take a large polymer chain, which has these hydrophilic, hydrophobic interactions. You attach an end of the polymer chain to a nano tip, and then you pull this nanotip away from the polymer, right? So the polymer is grafted on this surface, and then you're pulling this tip out, and what you can measure is the force required to pull out. And that force is actually because the polymer has to have, of course, there's an elastic force on the polymer, but it also has to overcome the interactions with the surrounding solvent. And when these measurements were done as a function of temperature, you can see that the force, this is the force, and then this is the solvation energy derived from the force, it actually has to increase with increase in temperature. And this tells you that you have to do more work to pull the polymer out, right? And how much more work depends on the temperature. And that actually tells you that this hydrophobicity has a temperature dependence, and it's a small change in force, as you can see. So there are these subtle interactions that one can today measure, which says that the hydrophobicity has a slight temperature dependence. We wanted to test our theory even further, and there was this very interesting experimental data that we had in the lab, which says that if I take a water ethanol mixture and put this polymer in it, it undergoes what is called a re-entrant phase transition. That is, the polymer is swollen at pure water, and the polymer is swollen in pure ethanol, but in between the polymer collapses. So it's swollen state in pure water. As you put ethanol, it collapses, and then you put more ethanol, it swells back again. So this is called a re-entrant phase transition. And so if my theory can predict this even qualitatively, then this is like a real hard test for the theory. And lo and behold, the theory does do a great job of it, and there are no fitting parameters here. This is pure prediction. It's not quantitative, but it captures the difficult re-entrant phase transition. So we were now very sure that this model really works well, and said, what else can we do with this theory? And the first thing we realized is that if I cut off the hydrophilic interactions, the gel does not undergo volume phase transition. And if I do the same with hydrophobic interaction, the gel again does not do volume phase transitions. So the presence of these two is very critical. And if you remove one of them, then the volume phase transition goes away. And that's why I said the trapeze artistry, the subtle balance between hydrophobic and hydrophilic interactions is very, very critical to these kinds of volume phase transitions. And that's why I said, you have to have this beautiful balance. If you don't, otherwise you'll fall off. And nature does this all the time. Cell membranes, for example, have exquisite balance between hydrophilic and hydrophobic interactions. And if that balance didn't exist, cell membranes would be unstable. And if cell membranes are unstable, we won't be alive, right? And so nature knows how to deal with these beautiful interactions in solids. And so we started doing more and more stuff. Here is a polymer that has a very hydrophilic group and a very hydrophobic. So these are two polymers, and we have copolymerized them, right? One is very, very hydrophilic and one is very hydrophobic. And so if you take the pure polymers, so this is the very hydrophilic polymer, it has very high swelling ratio and it doesn't change with temperature. And here is the hydrophobic polymer, it doesn't swell at all. And if you change the temperature, also it doesn't swell. But if you form this copolymer and at a very exquisite composition of 10:1, 10 of the hydrophobic, 1 of the hydrophilic, this polymer has a wonderful phase transition. In fact, this is the copolymer, this is a collapsed state, the swollen state, and at 12 degrees, you can actually see a coexistence of both phases, the swollen and the collapse. So this is really and truly a thermodynamic phase transition, and it's so subtle, it's so beautifully subtle. So the theory told us that you could change if you change the hydrophilicity and the hydrophobicity, you can tailor the volume phase transition. You can tailor the temperature at which the volume phase transitions happen. And why we are doing all this is, remember the first problem that was given to me. If I have a temperature profile on the diabetic feet, can the temperature sense it? And can it change the shape? So if I have a polymer that I can synthesize with good control on the hydrophilic and the hydrophobic interactions, then at a certain temperature, it will sense the temperature and undergo a collapse, right? And so there may be a way that I can design these polymers to sense temperature and do phase shape transitions. So here is what we did. We took this N-isopropyl acrylamide and we copolymerized with another molecule where I could vary the length of this spacer group, the CH2 group, right? And again, you can see that this is the hydrophobic part and these are the hydrophilic parts, right? And because then I can change the length of this spacer, I can change the hydrophobicity, and maybe I can change the volume phase transition, and that's exactly what happens. So as I change the composition of this polymer, you can see that the phase transition happens at different temperatures, exactly as the theory predicts, and the lines are actually the theory. And the experiments and the theory also tell us how this small change in the hydrophobicity actually causes the change in the temperature at which the volume phase transition happens. And you can now link it to the chemistry by changing the number of CH2 groups. I can actually control the temperature of phase transition and the subtle change in the hydrophobicity. Okay, and then we did lots of other things. If we put a transition metal ion, the transition metal ion actually acts as a cross-linker, and it also changes the hydrophilicity, hydrophobicity balance, and therefore the transition temperatures. This for students. I had my PhD student who did what we thought was a failed experiment. And it turned out to be, there's nothing like a failed experiment, by the way, okay? And this is a good example of it. So we had 2 ovens in my lab. I was not very rich at that time. So we had an old oven and a new oven. And the old oven was very rusted. And at one point of time, my student who was making all these gels did not find time in the new oven, right? Everybody wanted to use the new oven. Nobody wanted to use the old oven. So she couldn't get access to the new oven. She put her gels in an old oven, and she was very careful, she was very observant, and what she felt was, as she closed the door of the oven, some rust fell on this polymer. And from the rust, transition metal ions diffused into the polymer, and the polymer, what she put in was this piece of cylindrical hydrogel, and slowly overnight it transformed into that, right? And she thought this was very exciting. She was trying to understand what happens, and in fact, when she cut open the polymer, she could see that a sphere actually converted into a hollow object. It almost looks like a coconut. And so there is this self-organization that is happening. The polymer is actually changing shape from cylindrical to oval and spherical shapes, and very interesting stuff happening there. So we were using this polymer to see if we could do drug release, right? And so this is a case where we were measuring the release of protein, a trial protein like hemoglobin, and we are measuring how much protein is released as a function of time outside. And so, of course, because this was a large gel, it was taking several hours for the release to happen. So, can we make it faster? Can the release be faster? And it will be faster if I reduce the size of the gel. So, we started making smaller sizes, and we always found that when we made these small particles by grinding, they always stuck to each other. And we did not understand why we were not able to get these particles individually, why they were sticking to each other. This is the sort of particles, and you can see that they are a fused mass. So we are not putting any epoxy or adhesive, they're just sticking by themselves. We're trying to understand why that happens. Now this is very interesting because, in milk pouches, if you heat a milk pouch, you will seal it, right? And that sealing happens because the polymer chains actually go through the welding, and they diffuse and they start entangling with each other. And that's how sealing happens in plastic polymers. And that happens because the polymers can actually migrate. There is a center of mass diffusion of the polymer from one side to other. But if you have polymers which are cross-linked, there is no center of mass moment because they can't move. They are already bound to each other. And all our gels were cross-linked, right? So how is it that gels were welding, cross-linked gels were welding? And so here is an example of that. These are two polymer gels. They are cross-linked. They're swollen with water. Two pieces colored differently. They're the same polymers but colored differently. And all we are doing is just putting them together in water and see how they stick. Then nothing else we are doing. They put them in water, in touching with each other, and they stick. Right? This was very, very unusual, and they're very strong. You can stretch them and nothing happens to them. And so we started investigating why the hell is this happening. And what we found again is a beautiful evidence of so this is basically what is happening. You have two polymer chains from across the interface, and they start forming these hydrogen bonds. These are these interesting molecule which has this spacer group, the CH2 spacer group. And so they sort of talk to each other across the interface, and they start hydrogen bonding. And we have wonderful simulation evidence as well as spectroscopic evidence to see that actually this happens across the interface. So these spacer groups stretch their arms and start binding to each other through hydrogen bonds, right? So these are some very nice simulations that we did, but what is most exciting is that the length of the spacer group decides whether they will stitch across the interface or not. If you have too small a spacer group, they actually do not heal. The interface does not heal. If you have too long a spacer group, again they do not heal, right? In fact, what we see is that they fold back into themselves rather than stretching across the interface. And it's only when you have a certain amount of CH2 groups in the spacer group that they actually start binding to each other. So see how beautiful this, again, delicate balance is. Too few hydrophobic groups, the gels do not heal. Too many hydrophobic groups, they do not heal. It's just the right balance between the two that the healing happens, and the healing is quite spectacular. Okay, and this material, we've done lots of other things with it. You can grow cells on this material. It's very biocompatible, and if you have too much hydrophobicity, the cells don't grow, and they just stay there. They're small cells. If the hydrophobicity is exactly the right size, the cells beautifully spread and they adhere very nicely on these substrates. Okay, skip some of that. We also found that with the right amount of hydrophobicity, you can biomineralize these hydrogels. So we're creating hydrogels that are very biocompatible, and you can grow hydroxyapatite or calcium phosphate in these gels, and then so they become extremely biocompatible gels. And this is not work by us, but this is work by Bob Langer's group, a very, very renowned scientist in Harvard, in MIT, and what he's done is he's taken exactly the same polymer that we have, and he converted that into this exquisite material. This is actually a ring of this polymer joined together by other polymers that can dissolve in presence of low pH. And so you have this ring. The ring is loaded with a drug. You can fold this into a small capsule. So this is a capsule, and you can ingest it. And this capsule can go in your stomach, where the gelatin, which is the cover of the capsule, dissolves. And these linkers here, they are also soluble in low pH, which is in our stomach. So they dissolve. So they're starting to dissolve here. So this is the dissolution, and you get these pieces which go then into the intestine. And this polymer, which is our polymer, actually stays. It doesn't degrade in the stomach low pH condition, but starts degrading in the intestinal high pH conditions, and as it degrades, it releases the drug. So if you have a drug that you want to release only in the intestine, not in the stomach, these are the kind of devices called the enteric devices, which Bob Langer developed, and he also showed that you have to have that beautiful hydrophobic balance with the hydrophilicity in order to make a device like this. So this molecule has turned out to be quite a magic molecule for us, and we've done lots of very interesting things. But the bottom line is you have to have that beautiful balance between the hydrophobic and hydrophilic interactions. So I'll end here by saying that we have this stimuli responsive materials. We have just about scratched the surface of the iceberg. There's loads to be discovered still. Unfortunately, I don't have time now to do any of this, but I hope some of you guys will get excited and start looking at these very exciting materials. So that's from me. Thank you so much. I don't know if I have exceeded my time. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Lele, for your colorful presentation of the topic. Now it is time for questions. So you can shoot your questions at Dr. Lele.
Well, beautiful talk. So this prompts me the ionic thing that you talked about, that suggests many other possibilities that you touched upon towards then many other things can be done. Magnetism. Is one such possibility that comes to mind. Yeah. Electrical conductivities, transport properties, all that. So can you give some brief glimpses of these? Where is this material now going with additional stimuli such as magnetism?
Yeah. So many researchers are today looking at this or similar polymers for light-based sensing. Okay, therapies that involve shining lights, or as Professor Pradeep said, therapies that involve sensing magnetism. And so drugs which have small magnetic nanoparticles in them can be targeted to, let's say, a tumor, and then using either light, so like IR or magnetism, you can locally heat the gel, right? You locally heat the gel, and it will then release its payload, which is a drug that only will attack the tumor. Now, so if it is a tumor that is like a colorectal cancer, that is a cancer of the intestine, you need to ingest the drug. The drug has to pass through your stomach, which is low pH, without degrading. And so these are the kind of enteric polymers that people make, but they add other functional groups to it. So you can add a sensor that will absorb IR, right? Or that will have magnetic particles. and it will go through the intestine, go through to the tumor, which is blocking the intestine, and as it reaches the tumor, you then hit the gel with either magnetic field, like in a MRI machine, or shine IR, right? And then it will basically release that payload exactly in the tumor. So in the biomedical application, this is where these kinds of polymers are being used. There is another class of polymers which are not necessarily having this very delicate hydrophobic hydrophilic balance, but they have similar chemistry, and they have more ionic groups on them, right? And these polymers are today used for transporting ions, whether it is electrolysis or it is membrane separations and so on. There are these kinds of polymeric membranes which are used to transport ions, right? Biology uses a lot of these molecules to transport ions. The cell membrane, for example, has exquisite structure to transport very specific ions in and out of the cell, right? We still have to do a lot of work to exactly mimic that, but these are the kind of areas where a lot of work I see happening today.
Excellent talk, sir. I have a small couple of two small queries. First thing is, that's about, I'm also basically from agricultural background. I'm very much interested about those hydrogels for the agricultural applications. First question is about what is the lifespan of those hydrogels which are used for to retaining the moisture? And second one is, after the degradation of those polymeric gels in the soil, is it causes any toxicity?
Right.
That's all. Thank you.
Right. So I'll talk about the Gel Shakti polymer that we had developed. The Gel Shakti polymer, we did a large number of field trials in Marathwada, along with the agricultural institutes in two agricultural institutes in Marathwada. 100 acres of field trials were done. The polymer gel survives for one season, right? Because it's starch based. So it survives for one season and then it will degrade, right? When it degrades, almost all of it is starch, and the small amounts of cross-linkers there are based from acrylamides. Okay, they are very tiny. They are less than 0.5% of the starch that we use. So it's very tiny. Polyacrylamide, we don't know the soil toxicity effects yet, but the field trials that we have done have never shown any at least toxicity to the plants. Okay. So the plants have grown really well, and this was a product that was certified by the agricultural institutes, and that's before that certification you couldn't commercialize it. So after that certification we licensed the technology to IOCL. Right. So because it is starch based, it is very, very non-toxic.
Thanks for the nice talk. I have just one small technical question. The hydrophobicity that you're plotting, is it measured or means experimental or calculated?
Yeah.
So how did you do that? The hydrophobicity.
Measured.
Yeah. Did you measure that one?
There are different ways of measuring it. So one way is what with AFM, if I have these molecules are, by the way, 4, 5, 6 million molecular weight polymers, so they're fairly large. So with today's techniques, which we didn't have at that time, you can do these STM kind of measurements where you pull the polymer with a cantilever and measure the force required for it, and that gives you a sense of the hydrophobicity. The other is a thermal measurement. You can actually measure how many water molecules form a cage around the hydrophobic group, right? This polymer, even with a simple differential scanning calorimetry, we can measure precisely 13 water molecules forming a cage around the the isopropyl group. Okay. The other, the one with the methylene spacers, you would have anywhere between 3 to 8 water molecules which form a cage around it. So that caging effect is another measure of the hydrophobicity. So it's not a direct measure, it's an inferred measure of hydrophobicity.
So do you have some like equation for that, or how do you build that parameter?
So these are mean field theories. What we used were mean field theories, right? And so there is this is a parameter that in a way captures the hydrophobicity. Today you can do very detailed computer simulations of the exact caging of water molecules around the hydrophobes, right? And you can actually simulate and calculate how many water molecules form a cage around the hydrophobe.
Sir, how strong are these materials? Can we use it for example, wound covering in some of the patients?
Yeah, they're fairly strong. So you can do mechanical measurements on the stress required to pull. I showed in my video, for example, you can really pull them quite well. Of course, they're not as strong as a pure plastic because these are hydrogels, so there's water in it.
Okay.
But they are reasonably strong.
Have you used a nano indentation or anything of that sort?
Yeah, easy to do.
Okay,
Yes, very much.
Okay, thank you.
Type of the materials, time of the material. Yeah, I think in biomedical field very much so, and so Bob Langer's work is not that old, so a lot of applications in biomedical fields are coming up for the smartness of these gels. My work was in early 2000, late 1990s, so it was too early, I think.
Good morning, sir. First of all, I thanks to giving this section. I have a doubt that you says that you had made a transition metal. What is the characteristics of that metal? That's I mean that transition metal between hydrophobic polymer or hydrophilic polymer. What is the characteristics? Is it have the same characters of both characters of hydrophilic and hydrophobic, or a different character?
So what the iron does is, so on our polymers we have carboxyl groups, right? And so at higher pH you get the carboxylate ions, and if you have a multivalent transition metal ions like copper or lead or manganese, they will form ionic bonds with the carboxylate ions. So it's an ionic bond between the carboxylate ion and the multivalent metal ion, right? And because the metal ion is multivalent, it can form these ionic bonds with multiple carboxylate groups, and some of them would be on other polymer chains. So the metal ion then itself forms a point of cross-linking because it binds carboxylate groups from multiple polymer chains, right? And when it does that, it is the carboxylic ion groups are now tied up to the metal, so they are no longer available for water to form hydrogen bonds, right? And so now that reduces the hydrophilicity of the polymer. The hydrophobic groups are as such, nothing happens to them. So in a way you are reducing the hydrophilicity of the polymer, and as I've shown you, little change in that interaction suddenly makes the gel collapse. So you disturb these molecular interactions little bit and the gel goes from one state to another. Right? So that's what the metal ions do. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
The time is over for question and answer session.